Start recording. We are about to go live. All right. Welcome. Happy Sunday, everyone. How are we doing today? You just caught me here, finishing shucking up some peas, getting ready for everyone. We have a few minutes as everyone gets settled, so please find your way. You're in the right place. We're about to get started for another Pasta Sunday. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
I'm so excited.
Bella's here, as always. Shout out to Bella. How we doing today? Happy Sunday. We've already had a very eventful day. If you've been following along on Instagram, we got up early. We went and had some pastries at the one and only Bread Belly, which, if you live in San Francisco, I just got to give them a shout out. Incredible pastry products coming from Bread Belly over Clement Street. It's
yes.
Clement Street, right?
Yeah.
It is Clement Street. Got to check them out. Incredibly talented people.
We're still a little early.
We're early. We're here. I was just going to finish shucking my peas in preparation for today. It's pea season. If you've been to the farmer's market or the market, in general, you're probably seeing peas everywhere. If you've gone out to dinner, you've probably seen them on just about every menu.
Hey,
Don't
John.
let them run away from you. What's up, John? Welcome. I don't see the chat on my screen. Do you see the chat? Oh, how's everyone going? Where's everyone from? Let's get a little around the room. Sound off? Sound off? Where's everybody from? It's been a while since I've done one of these where I don't get to see everyone. The whole last round, last month, April,
yes.
was all, I could see you there, you could see me here. That was a lot of fun. I got to put a lot of faces to names for people that have been joining these classes regularly. So that was really great. I enjoyed that.
I enjoyed it too.
But now we're back to these, because these are nice because they're recorded. So anybody can watch them at any time, and you don't have to be here on Pasta Sunday. You could be anywhere in the world, literally, and watch it in any time zone, which is very convenient for a lot of people.
Yay, Boston's in the house, Dallas, Toronto.
Welcome.
Cheshire, England. Hello.
Oh, shout out Toronto. That is high on our list, is it not, Bella? As places to visit as soon as possible.
Very high on our list. Asbury Park, hey.
Welcome. It's 2 o'clock right now. Is your phone alarm going to go off today?
Nope.
No, not today.
Long Island in Kansas, Exton, Pennsylvania.
All over the country. Well, welcome, everyone.
Are our friends from Tokyo here today?
Maybe. What time is it? It's super early in the morning in Tokyo right now.
Sometimes we have
tomorrow,
Tokyo
right?
joiners. Yeah.
I know. I forget his name. He would join and he would be making pasta at like 2 in the morning with us to be able to doing it in real time, which is wild. I love it. So fun.
Really, really great.
Really great.
I think it's 2 o'clock.
Well, let's begin. 2 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. You're in the right place. If you're watching this live, fantastic. Welcome to the Sunday Pasta Party here in our home. We have Bella in the chat room, as always, helping guide the show and run the production behind the scenes. I know there's a lot of you out there that are watching this as a recording, so please enjoy yourselves, relax, watch this whenever you'd like. You get access to this forever, so you can refer back to the recipes and to this video anytime that works for you. That's the beauty of this whole virtual live stream experience. Today we're diving into the world of pasta and some beautiful spring ingredients, in this case peas. I'm just finishing shucking up mine. If you weren't able to find peas, that's okay. You can still make a beautiful and perfect pesto to go along with our ricotta, cavatelli, gnocchi, pasta. This is an incredible, versatile dough, depending on how you kind of want to handle it and shape it. I'm going to show you a few different ways on how to make that happen and come together. So before we get into things, perhaps a few housekeeping notes, right? So I already mentioned this is being recorded, so shout out to everyone that's joining later to watch. Also, everyone that's here. If it's your first time, welcome. If you're a new person, I'm thankful for having you and inviting me into your home. If you're joining us again and this is not your first, I want to say rodeo, but this is not a rodeo. I don't think I've ever been to a rodeo. But if this is not your first Pasta Sunday with us, welcome back. Thank you again. We have the chat room for questions. Anytime you have any questions, go ahead, drop them in the chat room live. Bella's going to field them to me, and then I'll be able to answer them for you. We'll try to keep the questions focused on what we're working on at that exact moment, just so things don't get totally derailed and we don't get confused talking about maybe something that happens at the end, at the beginning, because people are trying to cook along. This is meant to be a cook along, so we're working together in real time, cooking from start to finish, as long as you already have all of your ingredients in place. Mise en place. right? The one thing we should already have done is our Mortadella meatballs. We'll talk about those when we get to them, but the recipe is super easy, essentially combining all the ingredients, forming them into little small marble-sized meatballs, and just setting those aside. I already have mine done. Hopefully you already have yours done. If not, you can pause, click, pause, come back to those, get working on them, or just make them right alongside of us. Maybe there are two of you in the kitchen, sous chef and sous chef, or chef and helper, it doesn't matter. You can all work together to bring this to life. I believe that covers our housekeeping. Am I forgetting anything?
That's it. Let's get started.
Let's get started. Don't forget to take pictures. They say your food doesn't taste as good unless you take a photo of it first. I don't know if that's true. I can't help but fall into that routine.
I think that they just say, can you eat with your eyes first?
You eat with your eyes first. That's a much better saying. Yes. I like that saying. Yes. So don't forget to take photos. Tag us on Instagram. I love seeing everyone's creations, especially on Pasta Sunday. Let's dive into it. So I just finished shucking my peas, but we don't need these first. I'm going to set these aside down underneath, or actually I'll just put them right over here. And we're actually going to get started on our pasta dough. So for that, we're using ricotta as the base of our dough. I'm going to make this in one big bowl. You could do it on the countertop, like kind of with that old school well method in the volcano where you put everything in the middle. That works, but I find for this type of dough, it works much better and it's more contained to do it in a large bowl. So that's what we're going to do here to bring this all together. Down below, let's grab the rest of our ingredients, all right? I got a whole tray here because I'm organized. I have my mise en place. Everything's prepared and set. The star of the show is our ricotta. So ricotta, we could talk about this cheese for a quick moment. It's a twice cooked cheese. You can use fresh ricotta in this recipe. The one thing you do want to keep in mind is that you're straining your ricotta. I like to do this for consistency. Every time you buy ricotta, it's going to be a little bit different. Sometimes it has a lot of moisture in it, sometimes it doesn't. That's just the nature of ricotta cheese. So in order to keep the dough and the recipe consistent, having to add as little flour and additional ingredients as possible, I always like to put it in a strainer for at least a couple of hours. I mean, even 20 minutes makes a difference. You could do it overnight. You don't necessarily need to press any moisture out of it. We're not making ricotta salata. We just want to remove any excess whey or moisture from the cheese. So this is all my whey that drained out at the bottom. If you did this and nothing drained out, don't freak out. That's okay. Sometimes that happens, and that's the nature of working with ricotta cheese. It's twice cooked. Sometimes there's enough acid that coagulates the curd and causes it to not have much extra whey. If you did not do this, don't freak out either. That's okay. You're just going to end up adding a little more flour than I do in my recipe as we're doing this. And that's all right, because what we're focusing on is the technique. We're understanding what the dough should look like, what it should feel like, and how that comes together. And so we're really adding flour as needed, not necessarily going off of a specific amount in this case. So it helps that we're doing this all together. I have my strainer. I like using these spoons. I always point this out because the first time I learned this, I got super excited. I did not know this for a very long time. Is that these basket strainers that have these little hooks here, these are not hooks for hanging. They're hooks to put spoons or something into. So that way when you put it on a bowl, it doesn't fall down into the bowl. It holds it in place, and that way your cheese or whatever it is that you're straining doesn't get knocked and hit down underneath. I know, blew my mind. Hopefully that just blew someone else's mind today, because I find that one of the most exciting things about this tool. The whey here, you could get rid of it if you'd like. You could also bake with it. You could cook with it. I've used it as a glaze for pasta instead of like starchy pasta water. You can use it in place of milk in bread recipes, or you can make pizza dough with it. Keep in mind it is a little acidic, so it's going to change the way that your gluten comes together if you're using it in a gluten-based dough. But it's delicious. They use it and they don't let it go to waste in Italy. So there's good argument that you should do the same. We're going to start with our ricotta down in the bottom of our bowl. Then we're going to grab the rest of our ingredients. We have our melted butter, we have our egg, and we have our grated parm. That's all going to come together in this cheese.
Let's say it one more time.
Yeah, let's say it all together. We have our melted butter. It doesn't need to be boiling hot. It can really just be like room temperature softened. It needs to be easily manipulated butter. We have our grated Parmigiano. And then we're going to season this up, and we have our egg. We're going 1 egg, room temperature, If it's cold from the fridge, that's okay. I'm not going to get upset about it. You shouldn't either. But in most cases, you do want your eggs tempered when making dough, whether that be a regular pasta dough or this ricotta dough. Tempered eggs makes for a softer and smoother dough that doesn't require as hard of mixing during that process. So we're going to season this up, a little bit of salt before we get this all mixed together. You could go pepper in here too as well if you didn't mind the little black specks. I'm going to hold off on that just because I have the white pepper and the meatballs. So we're going to go only salt. How much salt? It's about half a teaspoon to a teaspoon. Really depends on the kind of cheese that you're using. Are you using really good aged Parmigiano? Are you using Parmesan with an S-A-N? Different salt contents, different amount of salt that you may need to finally season everything together. And then of course, our egg. We have not added flour or anything to this yet. And that's by design. What we want to do is bring this dough together without the flour, so that way once we add the flour, we're mixing as little as possible. And I'll explain why. I'm going to go with a spatula. I find that works really well for bringing this dough together. We'll switch to our hands eventually, but there's no reason to jump in there with wet, sticky hands, right? Are there any questions so far? How are we all feeling about this?
The only question was, should I have blanched my peas?
No. Nothing should be blanched yet, but that does remind me. Let's pause, because I forgot. We need to put a pot of water on the stove, and we need to bring it up to a simmer, so that way it's ready when we are. I have water in here filled up. This is about a 6-quart pot. I have about 4 quarts of water in there. I have a lid on it so it heats up quickly. I'm going to put that over low heat just so it slowly heats up. Take a moment and do that if you have not yet. I'm going to use this same pot for our peas and herbs as for cooking my pasta later. Just because I don't mind cooking the pasta in the same infused tea-like water that's going to have all the flavor of the pea and the herbs that we're going to then cook our pasta in. If you don't want to do that, or maybe you don't mind having 2 big pots on your stove, one for pasta, one for blanching, that's also an option as well. But we'll have that going over on the side. Don't worry about seasoning it yet. No salt. Salted water takes longer to come to a boil. So we're just going to have that on the side ready to go. Good? That was the only question.
Yeah, everyone has their pot of water on the stove. Let's get to making the dough.
So we go eggs, butter, cheeses, and salt all mixing together. Luckily, the egg yolk has color to it, so you can tell when it is evenly and equally mixed into our dough here. And it should still be very sticky. It's still very wet. And we can stop and kind of think about now, the next phase is what sort of pasta we are making here. When it comes to pasta, there's essentially 3 or so family trees. There's the egg-based doughs for things like ravioli, tortellini, tagliatelle, all of the noodles and filled pastas. Those are egg-based doughs. There are flour and water-based doughs. That's another family tree there. Those are for things like cavatelli, compunti, fusilli, orecchiette, all of those shapes that require holding and a lot of elasticity, not necessarily extensibility when it comes to making the shapes of pasta. Then there's the third family tree. Maybe it's its own tree, maybe it's kind of its own branch of the other 2 trees, but we're talking about like a gnocchi style dumpling dough. In this case, we're using cheese as a base. You could use potatoes, you could use polenta, you could use greens and egg and flour to kind of bring everything together. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, just about as many ways to do it as there are families and restaurants in Italy, because everyone does it their own way, and that's okay. That to me is kind of the beauty of Italian cooking, and this is my favorite way to do this. It's a very versatile dough. It's a very easy dough to bring together, and it's a good introduction into making pasta that doesn't require a lot of kneading. We're not developing a lot of gluten. There's not a lot of resting. So all of those things make it very forgiving. But it's also a great dough that maybe you make pasta all the time. This is like, hey, I may have a machine, I have a pasta room, I'm really into pasta making. This is still a really great dough to have in your back pocket for when you don't want to get out a bunch of eggs, you don't want to do a bunch of kneading, and maybe you're in the mood for a delicious, tender dumpling. Any night of the week, this dough could come together in about 20 minutes. Question?
Yes, this is for Ankita. Quick clarification for the ricotta. The weight in the recipe, was that before it was hung/strained? I lost water from mine, so down to below 300 grams now. So you should be fine.
You should be fine. Mine was the starting weight before it was hung. So I did 480 grams, which was like the size of the container that I had, hung, and then that's what I'm working with here. If you did 480 grams after it was hung, that's okay as well. The only difference, meaning you might need a little more flour because you have a little more cheese. If you lost a ton of water and maybe you have less cheese, you're going to use a little less flour than what you're seeing here. But that's the beauty of learning this technique, and we're not just relying on the recipe. It's more of like this roadmap that we're going to follow to get to our final destination, our pasta dough. Make sense? Good questioning.
Yes,
Kita,
and we'll
you said?
definitely point out the visual cues.
Yes, things you're looking for in the dough as you're cooking to bring this all together. So we have our family trees of pasta. We have a good idea of the direction we're going in here. We have our dough ready to bring together. I'm going to reach over here for my flour. So that's the next addition we're going to bring in small increments. What flour are we using today? Whenever making pasta, if you have 00 flour, that's usually what I reach for first because it is finely ground. So it's going to absorb and hydrate very quickly. This is a forgiving recipe, so if you only have AP flour, maybe you only have semolina flour, heck, maybe you only have bread flour, those are all going to work. They're going to hydrate in different times and slightly different amounts, but that's okay. Like I said, we're going off of visual cues and the way that it feels, not necessarily how much flour the recipe says, because like Ankita pointed out, every time you lose moisture, your recipe is going to kind of change depending on the kind of ricotta that you have. That's okay. Heck, even every egg's a little bit different because we're not weighing the egg down to the gram. Sometimes the egg's a little bigger, sometimes it's a little smaller, and that's okay, right? So we're gonna go flour. I'm gonna go about 1/3 of a cup at a time. So this is a 1/3 cup, it's heaping. We're not measuring grammage here, we're just gonna go by our eyes and slowly work the flour into the cheese mix until it comes together as a dough. So we're gonna go flour in, and that's why a bowl like this works really well. We'll come up here for a close-up so everyone can see how we're mixing and how this is coming together. And now our mixing technique is somewhat important. We're not just coming in here and stabbing and jabbing and going around like this, because one, you'll get flour all over the place, and you're breaking up the dough. You're not really doing any mixing. You want to use your spatula almost like it's an extension of your arm or your hand. It's just keeping your hand clean. So what I mean by that is you're coming in with the spatula and you're doing what we call folding. So you're scraping down underneath, you're turning the dough over itself, and then you're pressing down with the spatula to adhere everything together. And then you go a little scrape underneath, you turn and fold it over itself, and you use the spatula to press it down into itself. I like turning the bowl as I do this just to make sure there's no wet or dry bits on the bottom of the bowl that are not getting grabbed by the spatula. But this way, you're already starting to form the dough into a mass rather than keeping it spread out all over the bowl like that, where it's not really coming together. So it's going to take much longer, and it's going to be a much messier process than if you're treating the spatula, like I said, an extension of your arm or your hand. So that's our first 1/3 of a cup of flour, incorporated, still very sticky, nowhere near me getting ready to put my hands in there, but I'll just come in with another big heaping scoop of flour. We'll go right on top, press that into the dough, and then scoop and fold. So this is similar to making a potato gnocchi where you're cutting the dough together with the flour to slowly incorporate all of the potato with individual starch granules. You're doing the same thing here, but you're working the flour around the cheese, coating each individual piece of cheese with the starch from the flour. And you'll see it starts to dry up, it starts to stick together, it starts to fold and hold into a large dough-like shape.
And I really want to point out that this is completely different than, regular egg-based pasta dough that needs to rest for at least 3 hours. It's something that can come together super quickly and needs barely any resting. While, your traditional filled pasta shapes or noodles that you usually teach do take 3 hours to rest to have that proper
elasticity,
Exactly.
extensibility.
Exactly.
And so it's much harder to do a class or a live thing making the dough in person. So this works very well as a very approachable style dough. Now, next third of a cup of flour. I'm up to about a full cup all together now. Working that in, folding, pressing, and turning. The dough is still sticky, but it's slowly starting to dry up. You start to see the flour gripping the outside of the dough. And I'm using the back of the spatula to press it onto itself. And you can see it's almost ready now for me to jump in here with my hands, probably for this last couple additions of flour. How I know is I'm taking a close look at this, and you could kind of see that the flour is forming and sticking to the outside, creating like a dry layer on the surface of the dough, which is a great sign. That's showing that you're getting closer to the dough stage and less like a cheese-like product here. And the dough is very good at only absorbing as much flour as it needs. I would very much compare the way this feels to a biscuit dough. So if you've never made biscuits, then you don't really have any idea what I'm talking about. But if you have, biscuit doughs are kind of dry and shaggy on the outside, but still a little tacky and sticky in the center. And that's exactly what we're looking for here with our ricotta dough. So I'm going to jump in here now with my hand to finish mixing, because now it's getting hard to lift and to fold because it's all staying together, it's sticking together here in the bowl. I'm going to set my spatula aside. I'm going to come in with another third of a cup of flour, toss that over the top, and now I'm just going to work that in with my hand, doing the same motion where I'm turning and folding. And while this looks like kneading, you might be able to call it kneading. I wouldn't say it's kneading in the sense like you would when you're making bread or pizza or other types of pasta. Where that kneading, you're very much like putting your body weight into things. You're using the entire muscle of your arm. You're really trying to stretch and work the gluten in order to realign all of those proteins and create these strong chains and networks. In that case, that's not what you're trying to do. Too much mixing and too much working is going to lead to a chewier, firmer, harder dumpling or piece of pasta, which in this case, because of the cheese, you don't really want that. We have a lot of fat in here. Cheese is mostly fat. We have the addition of butter for the added flavor and fat. And so all of that fat will lead to a very tender dough if you allow it to be. What I mean by that is don't add too much flour, don't overwork the dough. Those are all things that'll take away from that tenderness. But if you're really careful and you're just barely mixing this together, and I know I'm in a good place because my hands are not covered in cheese. You can see here just the flour that's on them. That's a great sign. If your hands are covered in cheese, things are looking messy, you need some more flour. You got to take a moment, clean off your fingers, get some more flour in here, then you'll come back, be able to mix everything together. So what I'm looking for, I could switch this now over to my work surface, and I'm just bringing it together until I see that it's nice and smooth on the outside.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
It's soft, it's smooth, it's supple. I'm not really pushing hard. I'm not like working my weight into the dough. I'm just folding it over itself to incorporate this last bit of flour to the point where then I have a dough that's not very sticky on the outside, but still has a little bit of tackiness in the center. And so I'm just kind of turning and folding and turning and folding the dough, grabbing all of this last little bit of flour that I had from the bowl. And still the same thing I'm watching and looking for. The dough's not sticking to my hands. My hands are nice and clean. I mean, other than the flour on them, obviously. But they're not cheesy. They're not sticky. Dough feels good, nice and soft. And I'll pull mine close up to the camera so you can see what it looks like and what I mean by that. And you know what? I might need, because as I worked in all that last bit of flour, I can still feel it's a little sticky on the exterior. There's some tackiness to it that's coming to the surface. And as this sits, it's going to get stickier. So if right now it feels slightly sticky on the outside, by the time we set it aside and get back to it, once our pesto is made, it'll be very sticky to the touch. So take that extra minute now to work a little more flour into this. So now, if anyone's keeping track, that's 1 cup and 2/3 of a cup of flour all together that I've added. And I'm just going to work that last bit of flour in here, just so I know when this rests, it's not going to get super sticky on me, and I'm going to have a nice soft and workable dough. And like I said, this is similar to kneading, but really just kind of folding and pressing to get the dough to grip itself and slowly working this flour from the outside in. I'm not putting my weight into it. I'm not stretching it out with my hand. All things you'd be doing if it was like a flour and water dough or an egg-based dough. But we don't want that same gluten development. So very gentle hands, a loving touch. We're breathing life into making pasta. I mean, that's what it's all about. You're doing repetition. Every time you make dough, you're doing something that people for centuries before us have done. This same exact process. And so you're connecting yourself to the past. You're reliving the past and keeping traditions alive. I feel like that's one of my favorite things about pasta making, is that it connects us all together in all walks of life, in all different cultures and cuisines. You're going to find some sort of pasta, and that's just beautiful to me. Or noodle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to call it pasta, but something that resembles pasta. So, my dough here. I got that last bit of flour in. It's now nice and not sticky on the exterior. If I press it, it's not really bouncing back. It should leave a bit of an indentation, which is a good sign. If it bounces all the way back immediately, that means it might need to rest a little longer. You may have developed some gluten, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but just you need to let that gluten relax so that it doesn't bounce back. If I stuck my finger all the way into the middle, I'll do it for demonstrational purposes, it's still very sticky on the inside. So that's a good sign. You're not looking for a totally dry dough. You want it to be dry on the outside so that you can handle it, you can manipulate it, but you're not looking for something that is dry on the inside as well, because that's a different family tree of pasta. So now here, dough, dry on the outside, kind of like a biscuit. I'm going to grab a little bit of flour here and sprinkle it onto the bottom of my bowl. We'll put my dough in the bowl.
Just so it doesn't stick.
A little bit of flour on top, just so nothing sticks, nothing dries out. I'm going to clean off our hands and our table here. And then we're going to cover our bowl, either with like a clean kitchen towel, a lid, something just to prevent it from the air touching the dough and drying it out.
Or a shower cap.
A shower cap would work really. A reusable shower cap that you're not also using for the shower. Right? So I feel like it's crazy that we're living in a world where you have to say that, but I feel like that needs to be said. Not a shower cap you would actually use, but a shower cap that's clean specifically just for dough, that I like having something like that around. So now we could go here, quick wipe off of our hands. We're going to clean up our work surface, get our table together. We're going to set this aside.
Stay organized.
Here we're going to use to cover our bowl. That's just going to stop that from drying out. Lovely.
Stay organized, clean, space. This is something that you always try to tell everybody.
Right. Take a moment now, help yourself clean up, so that way by the end, there's not a huge mess to deal with. That's one of like my, secret, and I don't even know if it's a secret tip for pasta making and cooking, is to work and clean at the same time. So you're not really just waiting till the end to start cleaning. Otherwise, you'll often find yourself with a big, huge mess, and it makes and takes the joy out of cooking. And we don't want to take the joy out of cooking. That Julia Child's book, The Joy of Cooking. I think it is. It's a great segue.
It's a great segue.
Great segue to our all joy of cooking, because we all love what we do. So, towel, folded, done, cleaned up, organized. Next, we are on to pesto. For that, we're going to need our big pot of water. Like I said, I'm going to use this same pot to cook my pasta and to do my pesto. And then over here, I have all of my pesto ingredients. I was using a damp towel just to keep all of my herbs looking beautiful and fresh so they didn't die. Sitting in the fridge. They were picked earlier. And then we can take a moment to talk about this pesto. I'm using the word pesto very loosely in the sense. It's not necessarily a pesto in the traditional sense. It's pesto inspired. I like to focus much more on the technique because then it becomes versatile. It's something you can sub in and out depending on what you have access to. So in this case, peas being in season, one of my favorite ingredients. So I wanted to make it all about the peas, not necessarily all about the basil, where you can use this same recipe, take the peas out, put a lot more basil in there, you have a basil pesto. Maybe you didn't have peas or you didn't have basil. You can use a ton of cilantro, lots of mint, a little bit of kale. Maybe there's that bag of arugula in the back of your fridge that you bought when you're feeling healthy and you didn't know if you're going to use it. Well, guess what? Today's the day. You can grab that, throw it into the mix, and you'll have a pesto. We're incorporating everything in the boiling water here for two reasons. It's going to help keep things brighter and greener. And the second reason, it's going to allow us to use a wider variety of herbs and things, where if we didn't, the peas would be much harder to break down all those vegetable fibers. We'd have to worry about very large stems, where when I'm picking my herbs, I don't mind if I leave a little bit of this delicate stem on there. It's not going to bother me. Now, obviously, the big woody fibrous stems down at the bottom, I rip those away, compost them. But these top inner stems, we leave those in the mix. It's totally fine. The other thing to be mindful of, when you're picking through your herbs, nature does a great job of leaving these beautiful little garnishes for us. The inner leaves and the small little baby plushes of things like parsley, mint, basil. There are all those beautiful little microgreens that chefs pay lots of money for in restaurants to have them in little perfect trays. They also come on the big vegetable and the big plant. You just have to seek them out, pull them aside. I like pulling those out. I'll set them aside, and we can use those to garnish our final plate because, of course, like Belle said, we eat with our eyes first. And even if we're just cooking for ourselves, I always like to make it look nice.
I do too.
So we have all of our ingredients here. We have our boiling water.
Gina wants to know, my peas are sprouted. Is that okay?
Sprouted. I don't know what that means. Do you know what that means?
Are they? I mean, they should be fine. They have little sprouts on them.
Yeah. Oh, like maybe they're growing. Yeah, totally fine.
That's fine.
Like there's a little germ coming out of them because they
Yeah.
want to germinate and grow into more peas.
Yes.
Totally fine. Not to worry. They're just a little older. They're a little more mature. Not to worry. I guess you could think that, or you could say that the germ is sometimes bitter. And so it might make your pesto slightly on the bitter side. But I think because we have all these other ingredients, you could always balance it out with honey. You're not have anything to worry about. You can use frozen peas here if maybe you couldn't get to the market and find fresh peas. You can use snap peas, which is another variety of pea. Looks like a mini English pea pod. All you have to do is come down this upper part right here, peels, and you're able to kind of remove and strip away that stringy fiber. And then you'll take this and you'll slice it just into thin little pieces so that it cooks and blanches more evenly and quickly. They're also delicious raw. It's a great sign that you have good peas. So we have our water here. Up to a simmer. I'm going to season it very lightly. Not like salt water, not like seawater, not even like pasta water or blanching water. We just want a very lightly seasoned water. So there's a tiny bit of salt in there, a little bit of salinity for cooking our greens and our herbs, but nothing crazy. Then we're just going to take everything we have, get it into the water, and this process is going to take 2 minutes tops. Everybody in the pot, basil, parsley, mint, pea leaves. If you have any other kind of greens sitting around in your fridge or your garden that you're worried about using or you'd like to use, carrot tops works really great here. Like I said, cilantro, kale, arugula, fennel fronds, any of that, all of that can all go into the mix and it will just add a nice dynamic flavor to your final pesto.
It smells so good.
It should smell immediately right away, like somewhere in a pot. Now use a spatula or spoon, some sort of device, to press everything down into the water so that it has a chance to start cooking. And of course, don't forget all of your peas. Done. So, while these are cooking, we need to prepare our ice bath to stop the cooking. What is an ice bath? You could use that same exact bowl that everything was just in, fill it up with ice cubes and water, and you're ready to go. I like to have a separate container on the side filled with, just to save myself from getting wet, filled with ice, a strainer, and water. So that way I'm able to plunge everything into this ice bath and stop it from cooking. Because what's happening here, if you've never blanched a green vegetable, it's a very common technique. What it does is preserves the green color by rupturing all of the chlorophyll cells in the plant. The chlorophyll is what traps and captures energy from the sun. All of that chlorophyll rushes to the surface of the plant. You see this bright, beautiful green color. And then eventually chlorophyll will degrade if it continues to be exposed to high heat. That's where our ice bath and our ice water will come in. We're then able to remove all the greens, stop the cooking, and preserve that bright green, beautiful color. Now, depending on how quickly it takes for your pot to come back to a boil, this really only takes 2, maybe 3 minutes of cooking to soften all of those vegetable fibers, to set the chlorophyll into a beautiful, vibrant, bright green color. And during that time, you can make sure you have the rest of your components ready to go. I'm using a lime here to bring my acid and acidity to the dish. You could use orange, you could use lemon. I have my grated cheese, Parmigiano. And then you need something for texture. You could use pistachios, you could use pumpkin seeds, you could use sunflower seeds. If you wanted to be a purist, you could use pine nuts. But I think pistachio adds a really nice, interesting flavor to this. But if you can't eat nuts, pumpkin seeds are usually my go-to way to sub in that bit of texture. So if you notice, we have something for acid. You can use anything in that case. That'll bring you that citrus note, grapefruit, orange, lemon, lime. You need some sort of cheese to bring you that umami. You could use miso, you could use parm, you use feta, you could use blue, you could use goat cheese, pecorino, pretty much any cheese that you want. It's gonna add some nice creaminess and nuttiness. And then you need some sort of nut or seed to give yourself that bit of texture and thickness to the entire mix. I'm boiling over here. I'm stirring just to make sure everybody's cooking evenly and nobody's staying up at the top.
What's that skimmer spoon? This is from F. Boyer.
I think this is a spider. It's called a spider. In the description to this video, if I do remember correctly, there should be an Amazon link to this. Bella, will you confirm? Down at the bottom, useful tools I use.
Yes, absolutely. I think yes, it's there.
It's there.
Yep.
So you could get this there. They're super handy dandy. I like them for cooking pasta and greens and things like that, because then you're not like pouring hot water into the sink and getting a facial with steam and all this craziness. This works really well.
And what is your ice bath setup?
So this is a pasta basket like you would find in like a restaurant supply sort of store, and this is a metal bain-marie filled with ice and water. So I just have these tools because I cook in a restaurant and I have them around.
And like you mentioned,
but you could totally use a bowl filled with ice and water and you're going to be fine. If you have like a basket strainer or something you can set in the water to be able to quickly remove the greens, that works as well. So this has been in here boiling for about a minute now. I'm going to go from the hot water to the cold water, get everybody in the mix. So pesto is one of those things I learned has a very, very deep history in Italy, and every region does it their own way. You know, there's pesto Chaponese, there's Ligurian pesto. Obviously, the most famous or well-known version of pesto comes from Genovese, where they grow basil. And their pesto is so highly regarded, it's certified DOP, like protected origin. The way that the leaves of basil are treated, the amount of sun that they get, where on the plant they're allowed to grow, how often they're clipped and trimmed, all of those things. They're like trained professionals, people who dedicate their lives to growing basil. And they're like government offices that ensure no one is like cheating the system in terms of how their basil is grown. That's how serious they take their pesto there in Genovese. You probably never see them do it like this with other ingredients. It's one of those things where it's like basil, parm, olive oil, garlic, and pine nuts. But we're kind of taking that idea of pesto and reimagining it using modern equipment and what ingredients we have here with us. You know, I was reading about Genovese, and one of the interesting tidbits that I saw in like 2 different articles, which like is the only reason I mention it, is they say that a baby's first food is pesto before like they have anything else, which I don't know if that's safe. I would not recommend that. I'm not a parent. Don't come to me for parenting advice. or nutrition for your child, but I think that's just a testament to say how much and how seriously they take their pesto there in that region. I wouldn't say that's a fact by any means. So we have our pot of water back on the side. I just lowered the heat so it doesn't boil away. I threw a lid back on it. I'm going to use the same water for cooking our pasta later. Our greens in the ice water, I always like to move them around just to make sure there are no pockets, because sometimes in this small contained space like this, the center stays very hot and it just gets cold around the outside. So moving everything around allows that cold water to get into the inside of all of these greens, and that way everything chills beautifully and evenly. Fantastic. So that's ready to go. Then over here on the side, I'm making my pesto here in a blender. You could use a food processor. You could use a mortar and pestle. I find a blender makes a pesto to the consistency I prefer. Very smooth, just a little chunky, not very oily, and emulsified. All the things that I want to see in a pesto. I personally don't like the very oily, runny, loose pestos that kind of break on the plate and have like oil floating at the top of the container or the jar. It's just too much. You could always add more oil, but I'd rather have something that acts as a base component that I could add oil to if I want it oily, but it's very hard to take away once it's all there. So I find by doing it like this in a blender, you're able to control how much of everything goes in, and then that way you have a pesto that is much more versatile and to me much more delicious. So we're gonna go in the blender. If you're going food processor, great. If you have a NutriBullet or one of those like flip over upside down blenders, that works just as well. Just keep in mind you might have to stop, put more ingredients inside, and blend again. Cool, right? So we're gonna go drain from the water here. And I'm not going to push all of the water out. I want a little bit of that water left on all of these greens in order to help everything spin and come together. Because I'd rather have this cold, seasoned pea, mint, basil water to help this spin and loosen the mix than olive oil. And that's just me. But if you want to add extra oil, that's totally fine. I give you permission. I like to start with all of my greens and peas down on the bottom. Break them all up just to make sure that you don't have any pieces too well stuck together. It helps give your blender a nice head start. Then on top of this, we're going to start layering in the rest of our ingredients to go into the mix. So a little bit of black pepper. You can go a lot of bit of black pepper if you'd like. Today I'm feeling a little medium amount of black pepper. I'm going to go a touch of salt. And you could always add more salt. Start somewhere. I'm going a little bit of a spoonful here. I did this size spoon. It's about a teaspoon. We're going to go cheese. And I'm going to hold a little bit of cheese back just so I have something to garnish my plate with, because a little bit of cheese on top is always nice. You kind of get that beautiful bite of parm. We're going to go our nuts or seeds. We have 1 clove of garlic. You could go 2. You could go half a clove. Really just depends. Sometimes garlic's a little more pungent than other times. I like to microplane the garlic into the mix. Or grate if you don't have a microplane. But what ends up happening when you do it like this is you ensure that no matter how powerful or not so powerful your blender may be, you're not going to end up with any chunks of garlic that you might bite into because they're already all broken down and grated.
I think that's a very important step.
Very important. I mean, I think so.
Yes. I hate biting into things and it's like this giant chunk of garlic and you're like, no.
And I know exactly what she's referring to is sometimes I blend your smoothies and I don't blend it enough and you bite into a piece of ginger. And it's not the most pleasant thing. And so always make sure that things are blended well. Or
the same thing goes with garlic.
Grate them down. Now I'm going to use just the zest of the fruit here to add a bit of brightness, acidity. What I mean by that, just the zest, is that bright green or yellow portion turning while I spin and grate. Not getting any of the white. That white tends to be very bitter, so you want to leave the white, the pith, on the fruit. I've seen people zest like this up in their hands, where they hold it and kind of just scrape, and that way everything stays on the grater. I don't really like this method because there's still a bunch of essential oils here in the fruit that are spraying up into the air. They're getting lost. I want all of those essential oils sprayed down into the blender, so that way they're going into our pesto.
And then make sure not to get the whites. I think that's a really important part of grating.
Very important.
That they'll tell people.
And then you also notice, every microplane or every grater is a little bit different sharpness. So you'll kind of find the right amount of pressure you need to apply. The one golden rule here when you're dealing with this is you don't want to add the juice. The juice is straight acid. And acid in green things causes them to turn brown much more quickly. If we're using just the zest, though, you get all those terpenes, all those essential oils, all that flavor of the citrus without any of the acid, and so things are going to stay beautiful, bright, and green. I like to always top it off with just a touch of honey. I think the honey, it's not really there necessarily to taste it and be like, oh, this is really sweet. It's there to kind of balance out the spiciness of the garlic. It's there to round out and bring out the sweetness of the basil and the peas. And, a little bit of that honey, syrup, sugar, whatever it is that you're using to sweeten. You could use agave, would be great really here too as well. To help brighten things up and really round out the whole dish. Then last but not least, we're going to go a little bit of oil. And so I probably start with about 1/4 cup of oil here in the blender. And like I said, I could always add more oil, but in most cases, I rather add some water. And so I start with about 1 tablespoon or so of my ice water in the blender to help this whole thing start to spin and mix, and that way it doesn't get very oily and it stays nice and smooth and creamy and emulsified. So let's go here on the blender. We'll go lid on, and I'm going to mute us for a second so things don't get super loud. So if you're on Invita Prep, that was speed 8 for what, about 30, maybe 45 seconds. I use the tamper to push everything down. We can see here now we have a nice semi-smooth mix. We could go very close in the camera and I'll show you what we're looking at here. And I didn't end up adding to need any extra water or oil to help it spin, but you'll find, depending on the strength of your blender and how everything's coming together, you might need a little bit of extra water or you might need a little bit of extra oil to help everything mix and emulsify in the blender. Let me show you what we're working with here. We have a beautiful, smooth and semi-chunky, like this isn't a perfectly smooth puree. It still has some texture from the cheese, from the nuts, which is exactly what you want, but it's not broken, it's not oily. It's somewhat thick, almost like a, what is the consistency here? I almost kind of want to say like a chunky peanut butter.
Kind of.
Where it's like, it falls off the spoon, but it holds in place as well.
Yeah.
Because you could always thin this out. You could add liquid to it when you're cooking and using it. You could add oil to it if you want it a little looser. But when it's thick like this, you could use it as a spread on a flatbread, on a sandwich. You could put it onto toast. You could use something like that. You could cook your eggs in it if you like, seen that pesto egg sort of trend. This is a great thing to have in that somewhat thick form, so that way it's more versatile and you could always thin it out. So I have everything here in the blender. I'm just going to leave it in the blender on the side, and I'll go right from the blender when I'm ready to use it. We need to taste it. I almost forgot. The most important rule, everyone grab a spoon. We need to jump into the mix.
Come on, Joe.
And make sure you like what you're working with. I've made this so many times. I'm so used to being like, oh yeah, I'll taste it later. No, I taste it now. Everybody needs to have the same good habits, right? So let me tell you what you're tasting for. Your palate is a muscle. So you need to work that muscle out. You should be tasting a little bit of everything. Tiny bit of pistachio, nice creaminess from the peas, salty umami nuttiness from the parm, slight bit of spice in the back of your throat from that garlic, and then a nice rounding of kind of what are those other spices or other herbs, maybe some parsley, maybe some mint, a little bit of everything, kind of bouncing all over the place. If any one of those flavors are too in the forefront and it's not well rounded, you're going to use the other ingredients that you have to bring that one back into the mix. Like let's say it's way too garlicky. You could add a little bit more cheese, or you could add a little honey, and that'll pull the garlic in. Maybe it's way too nutty. You could add a little cheese or a little honey, and that'll pull the garlic in. What did I just say? The nuttiness in. If it's way too cheesy, well, said no one ever, right? But if it's way too cheesy, you could add a little bit of oil or a little bit more zest to kind of pull in that umami nuttiness that you would find from the cheese.
But you're
and so you're looking for a little bit of everything to bring it together. And what were you going to say?
No, you're definitely using your palate to understand the well-roundedness of everything.
Precisely. So that goes down. All these ingredients now, I believe we're done with. I'm going to save my forks because we need those. I need my spoon.
And then we're on to pasta making.
And we're on to pasta world. Any questions so far?
No questions so far. I think everyone's staying on track.
So great. Good. I love it.
I know. I love when people do your classes.
So good. So our dough has been resting, and really this dough does not need to rest very long. 5 minutes is usually all you need to allow that little bit of gluten that may have developed to relax, and in whatever case there may be, the flour to hydrate with the cheese. So 5 minutes is usually a good. The 10, 20 minutes it takes to make the pesto, even better. I like to pull my dough out from the bowl. We'll just set it here onto the work surface. And I have a little bit of flour left on the dough ball from the resting. I do also, I forgot to wipe down, I got a little bit of water here from my pesto party. So just make sure your counter's not sticky. Now we have our dough, right? Shall we switch views? I think we should switch.
I think we should switch.
We'll come in close for the real thing, huh? So, time to make some pasta, right? We have our dough here. I'm going to use a bench scraper to cut everything into portions. You could use a knife. I would not recommend ripping and tearing it with your hand. Tearing and ripping promotes gluten. Like I said, gluten, not necessarily our friend here. We don't want anything chewy, stretchy, or sticky. So, I'm going to cut off a small chunk of dough about the size of my hand. Fits in my hand nicely. This is about 2.5 ounces or so, if I had to guess. And we're going to start making serpentines, or what the Italians call snakes. So using the weight of our arms, we're going to press down on the dough, rolling back and forth, working the dough from the middle out towards the ends. Now what I mean by that is we're not working on one side and trying to go across the dough. It's very hard to push the mass of dough from one end all the way across to the other, and it's much easier to grab the dough from the middle and move it out towards the outside. So I'm picking up my hands every time I get to the end. Think of it almost like a typewriter. You're working out towards the sides, then you go cha-ching, and it comes back to the middle, and then you're able to push everything back out to the ends again. Now, some troubleshooting things that I've seen go wrong here. If you're rolling and you notice that your dough is just sliding on the surface of your table and it's not rolling, it's because you have too much flour down. Take a moment, remove some of that flour, come back with your dough, and then you should have that tiny bit of tackiness that the dough needs in order to roll. Now if the opposite is happening, maybe you're trying to roll and it's just sticking to the work surface and sticking to the table, a tiny bit of flour might be all you need to stop the dough from sticking and allow it to roll nice and smoothly. Now how long you make your dough is really just going to be determined on how much dough you grabbed. The width, on the other hand, is a little more important. That's what everybody focuses on anyway, right? The width of things, not how long it is. I usually like to go about the width of my finger or my thumb. It's about an inch. You could go thicker or you could go thinner. At the end of the day, it's just going to determine how big your cavatelli or your dumplings end up being. If your dough rips or tears anywhere, that's totally fine too. Don't worry about it. You could work with small or serpentines as we're going. Then you're just going to come in here, grab another piece of dough, begin to roll this out. And you're looking to make it about the same width and about the same length as your other snakes. And now at this point, this is where pasta therapy really comes into play. You really fall in love with the process. You settle in to the pasta table and you're finding your rhythm. You find kind of your pace, what makes sense. And for me, this was always the most relaxing part of working in a restaurant, because it could get very crazy and chaotic out there depending on what orders didn't come in, menus have not been printed yet, things that might be changing, maybe you have VIPs coming in that night. So there's always a lot of different things going on, where when you go and make pasta, and you can kind of take a moment to settle in and relax and turn off your brain to everything else going in the outside world. And maybe you're not in the restaurant, maybe we're working life and everybody has a lot going on in life, and pasta making can be that thing where you're focused on the here and now, and you're almost turning off all of those other senses, and you're just allowing all of your senses to really get absorbed by the dough making process, by the dough making ritual that's happening here. And you're putting your love and your energy into what you're doing. So you want to make sure that's good energy and good vibes, lots of love. You're breathing life into something. You're sharing yourself with either yourself or someone else that you're cooking for. And so pasta making becomes a very intimate and sensual sort of experience. And I fell in love with that romantic part of pasta making, but also the therapeutic, almost yoga-like, Zen-like aspect of the whole thing. So I'm getting down here to my last snake. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 serpentines in length here. Last one is rolled out. Now, if you're not at this point and you need to catch up, that's okay. Don't worry. Take your time. I've made a lot of serpentines in my life, and so I'm able to roll these out rather quick. But if you're still on your first one or your last one, don't fret. Take your time with it. Don't force it or rush it. I'm going to take a little bit of extra flour now, and I'm going to dust it over the whole surface of all of my snakes, and I'm going to bring them close together. Now, it's important to have a nice bit of flour on the exterior of all of your pasta, so that way as we cut it, it does not stick, touch, and come together. Because if you remember, the center of our dough is still very sticky. So what we're looking for here is to have the exterior coat of the flour so that stickiness doesn't reattach to everything. So now I'm going to come in again with my dough knife. You could use a regular knife. And I'm just going to go down the entire length and cut these into small little squares. I'm going about the same width as they are thick, or the same thickness as they are wide. So you end up with a beautiful square pillow. And you could cut these longer or shorter, totally up to you. And at this point, now you have some creative decisions to make. So we have all these beautiful pieces of pasta. They're ready to go. You can cook them as perfect little pillows and dumplings, just like this. You could find yourself a gnocchi board of sorts, a wooden or ridged board like this, where you can take each individual piece of pasta, roll it onto the board, and then you have gnocchi or little cavatelli. Cavatelli simply meaning little hollow. So that little ridge or hollow in there would consider this a cavatelli. You can do small little mini versions of that come out like this. Maybe you don't have a board, but you have a fork. And you could come here with your fork, placing your piece of pasta on the fork, using that same amount of gentle pressure from your thumb, and rolling it off the edge of your fork, giving yourself beautiful little ridges and a nice little cup to hold the sauce. Let me do that again for anyone that missed it, because I know it happens very fast. It's kind of hard to go slow, especially when making pasta. We're placing it onto the fork as if we're about to take a bite. I'm going to come in with my thumb, press down on the pasta, and roll the fork as I'm rolling my thumb. That allows the dough to cup off the end into a beautiful cup shape. Another option. You have a few different variations here that you can do depending on how you're feeling. But for this particular dish, I like to do something a little different. So we have our beautiful mortadella meatballs rolled about the size of marbles. And what I like to do is then take my gnocchi, or my cavatelli in this case, and roll them into small little balls about the same size as my mortadella meatballs. So now this way, as everything comes together and it's tossed in one nice big pan with all of our pesto, our meatballs, our pasta, what ends up happening is then everything is coated. You're going and taking these wonderful little bites, and it's always a surprise. Am I going to get a meatball? Am I going to get a piece of pasta? Maybe I'll get both. I don't know. And that's kind of one of the joys of eating this and cooking this, are those like little surprises. And so yes, it does take an extra couple minutes to sit here and ball up every little piece of pasta, but you know what? Pasta making's about chilling, relaxing, hanging out with that special someone you're with, or maybe you're connecting with them virtually and you're both cooking, making this right now. Maybe just on the phone with someone, or you're just chilling. Either way, this is part of the process.
Yeah, and you should all applaud yourselves right now if you're making pasta, because it's been an hour and you just all
And you have pasta,
and you
fresh
have
pasta.
and some pesto. How magically things can come together in less than an hour.
This is one of my favorite doughs, like I think just for that reason, because it's like most people don't expect a bowl of cheese to turn into a beautiful dough that could then be pasta in such a short period of time. Most people don't even think of cheese as a base for pasta, and ricotta is incredibly versatile in that sense. Maybe you don't have ricotta. I've done this recipe. There was someone that took a private class of this at one point, and he couldn't find ricotta, but he found yogurt, and he did this whole thing with yogurt. He hung the yogurt to remove some extra moisture. He ended up having to add a little bit of extra flour, but it worked. I saw it. I didn't get to taste it because obviously we weren't there with each other. But he loved it. It looked great. And so that just kind of like opens up the door with an endless number of possibilities. See what I did there? Of the way that this can go. So I'm going to come through and just make enough of these little rounds for one bowl or plate for our demo purposes here. But while I'm rolling these, let's talk about our mortadella meatballs, right? Because we think we all haven't done it at this point. Maybe you're getting into it, maybe you're not. Either way, meatballs, one of my favorite things in life. I grew up eating them multiple times a week in my house, my family. My mom's meatballs were, dare I say, world famous. I don't know. I like to think so. But they were something that we always had in the fridge and in the freezer. She would make a giant batch at least once a week, and then half of them would get frozen. The other half would eat throughout the week, and they were always like emergency meatballs on supply for friends or family or neighbors that may have come by. And while these are not my mom's meatball recipe, they're inspired by the idea of using a flavorful base. And in her case, she would like make a sofrito of onions and garlic and all these aromatics cooked down that she would add to the meat in order to boost up the flavor of the ground beef or the ground pork. So I was like, one of my favorite meats are salami and mortadella. So finocchino is a fennel salami. My mom used a lot of fennel in her meatballs. And so ground salami, ground mortadella, there's a ton of spices, a ton of fat, a ton of flavor in mortadella, taking the ground version of both of those meats, combining it with your plain ground pork. Now all of a sudden you have an incredibly powerful and flavorful meatball base. You add your egg as a binder. No need for any breadcrumbs. The egg and the yolk is all you need to hold it together. You got the cheese for that nice added bit of punch. And then I like a little bit of white pepper, nutmeg in there because those are flavors that you find in the mortadella already. And then you're actually not very far off from a pasta filling, whether it be a traditional classical tortellini filling or some sort of meat filling. You can put into a Cavatelli and brodo, something like that.
So there are a few questions. Gina wants to know, should there be a hollow underneath if you're using a gnocchi board? And then Andrea said, could you please show how to roll on the gnocchi board again? Thanks.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Say the first question again. I missed what you said.
Should there be a hollow underneath if you're using a gnocchi board?
A hollow underneath if you're using a gnocchi board.
Yeah.
Yes. So 2 questions. Someone wanted to see gnocchi board again. Let's talk about it. So we have our gnocchi board. If you have one of these with a stick, the stick actually works really well. You put it in the hole at the top, and it acts as a stand for your board. So that way you're able to just press right on it. If you don't have a stick and it's just a handheld board, that works just as well additionally. So what you're going for here, for the board, you're placing the piece of pasta on it, and with your thumb, you're applying just enough pressure to allow it to roll. And it should slide down. There should be a nice hollow, and you should also have the ridges on the other side of the board. We can do it again in the air towards you if that's a little easier. Placing the piece of pasta, rolling it down on the board. It should curl up and over, allowing you to then have a nice cup. Cavatelli would probably be something more similar, where you start with a smaller piece, less square, more rectangle. You do a rounded roll, and then that way you have a much smaller ridge and a longer, wider piece of pasta, versus a gnocchi is probably something made from more of a square, cavatelli more from a rectangle. But both of them, I think, very rough, loose definitions of the word. Last thing we could do, this fork one more time in case someone missed it. On the fork, as if you're going to take a bite, rolling, same, finding that right amount of pressure, and tilting the fork up to allow it to curl and come off of the fork, giving you the ridges. And if you're having a hard time doing this, I swear, it just takes finding that right bit of pressure. Not too hard, not too soft, to allow it to just come together. And so I have this little pile here. That's probably enough for the amount of meatballs that I have to give myself a nice little bowl. We were talking about more. I think I finished the meatball story, right?
Yes.
Everybody knows what's in the meatball. Any more questions about the meatballs? I was saying this works really well as a pasta filling. It freezes really well. I always keep extra Mortadella meatball mix in my freezer, and then that way I have it as a tortellini filling or as a meatball base, depending on what I may need it for. You could also use it as like the base of a ragu if you wanted to like cook it down. That works as well. So incredibly versatile. Nice little mix.
Yeah, everything you make is really versatile.
I don't like to teach those like very single-use recipes. I like recipes that like you're able to use in all different aspects and ways, depending on, you know, how you're feeling, what you have access to, and how you want to use it and put it together.
Because that's really cooking.
That's cooking. That's thinking. That's using the recipe as a roadmap. You're understanding the whys behind what you're doing and not just the hows. Very, very important. So I'm going to get through about half of these, make sure I have enough to give myself one nice big bowl. And you can find a great speed to go at. Great. So these I'm going to set and save aside. If you have extra dough, like I have here, you have two options. I would not freeze everything in its raw form. What ends up happening is if you try to cook frozen gnocchi or frozen cheese or potato-based doughs like we have here, your water is not going to come back to a boil fast enough to be able to set the dough. So everything just sinks to the bottom of the pot and it'll eventually break apart and become waterlogged. Instead, what would work really well, and what I recommend, is you cook this in batches or all at once. Take out what you're going to set aside and save, allow it to cool in a bowl, on a plate, on the side. Toss with a little bit of oil so it doesn't stick together. Once it's chilled, you can freeze it all spread out on a tray in the freezer, put it into a bag, containerize it airtight. You'll get at least a month out of it in the freezer. You'll get a longer shelf life in the fridge out of it. I wouldn't say more than a week, but you could, use your best judgment. And at that point, it's ready to go. You could toss it with your sauce. You throw it in the microwave, whatever it is that you need to do to have a quick, ready-to-eat pasta meal at any time. Just take the time today to blanch all of these. You don't need to shock them in ice water, but just cook them in hot water, allow them to cool, and they'll be ready to go when you need them.
We do have a question from Lauren. She says, I have a meatball question. Any non-pork options you recommend? No meat also works.
Yeah, so a great no meat would be impossible meat with an egg. Lots of cheese. You could even throw like some ground fennel seeds, some chili flake, a splash of white wine, like all of those things you would find in sausage. You could add all of those flavors to your impossible meat. You could use ground chicken, you could use ground turkey, you could use ground beef.
No meat too.
And no meat would be impossible meat.
Yeah.
And then all of I wouldn't use mushrooms.
No.
It's not going to hold together.
Yeah.
Any of those like meat substitutes would work. And then think of like, Google, look up a fennel salami recipe or what's in finocchino. It's like pork fat, pork, chili flake, fennel seed, garlic, red wine, salt, pepper. So take all of those ingredients, minus the meat, add it to your meat substitute, and then you have the flavor of sausage, the flavor of these wonderful meatballs in your meat substitute. Could you make it without egg? I don't know. I haven't tried it. You might be able to get away with like putting breadcrumbs in there. It's probably going to be very delicate, like to the point where it could fall apart. If you don't mind that, that's an option as well. So, water. Bring it back up to a boil now. We're ready to cook and bring everything together. Sound good? Sounds great. Yay! Hooray! This is when everybody goes cheers and is ready to eat.
I'm excited.
I'm excited as well.
Let's do it.
Water is coming up to a boil. We can get ready to season our pasta water. What I mean by that, seasoning our water, we have a little bit of salt in there from earlier, but now we want to bring that salt level up to cook our pasta. We're not talking salty like the sea. That's way too salty and it's a terrible phrase. Take it out of your vocabulary and don't ever say it again, because salty like the sea is just unpalatable. You don't want to eat that. Instead, your pasta water should be something that's delicious. Think of it almost like water soup or water stock, something you can dip your spoon into, take a bite, and you're like, oh, that's quite nice.
We do have one more question from Andrea. What's the longest the dough can rest before rolling out the serpentines?
I would say that's a good question. Andrea? Mm-hmm. Shout out to Andrea. Great question. So if your dough is in the dough form and you don't plan on using it within the hour, I would stick it in the fridge. And then I'd say you have probably 6 to 8 hours or so to use it before it starts to get elastic, and that flour will naturally interact with the water and start to form gluten. Things will start to get very sticky and stretchy. This is not necessarily the dough you make the day before or the night before. You can make it like the afternoon of for dinner, but there's a limit to how far you can make it in advance. I like a couple of hours. You could probably push it, like I said, to 6 or 8, but I wouldn't go the night before. I wouldn't necessarily go the early morning of, unless you want it for lunch. It'll just start to get very sticky, and same thing like these. You could leave them in the fridge overnight on a tray in dough form like this, but they'll start to get sticky. They'll start to get sort of dense and chewy, and they're going to lose that like light, wonderful tenderness. They'll still be good and edible. They're just going to have a different texture and different mouthfeel. So I always like to cook them all now and then kind of set that wonderful, beautiful texture, and then you can eat them scattered throughout the week. So we're going to go. I'm trying to think the order to do this. Like I was saying, we're into our pasta water. We have not put anything in the pasta water. The question threw off my train of thought. Bella's looking at me like, huh? We got to season our pasta water. Like I was saying, not salty like the sea. It should taste good, right? I'm going to pretend like I have a separate burner. Set my pasta water over there. I'm going to move all this to the side so I can bring my stove in and everyone can see what's happening in the middle. And we're going to get started on cooking our meatballs first, because our meatballs are going to be the base of our pan sauce. It's then going to be the base for our finished dish. So stove comes in. Perfect. Over here, separate pan. We're going large saute pan, high heat, nice and hot. You can go non-stick here. You can go wide, you can go shallow. I like something just proportional to the amount of pasta and meatballs that I'm making. And so, hot pan, heating up. We're going to add just a small layer of olive oil down in the bottom of the pan. That's going to help our meatballs not stick. It's also going to give us a good visual cue of when our pan is hot. Of course, you can put your hand over the hand, your hand over the pan and feel any additional heat that may be coming up from there. But you're also using visual cues. When the oil starts to get loose and show signs of rippling, that's a sign that things are heating up, that you're almost ready to put your meatballs, drop them into the pan. You can also test it. So what I like to do is just drop a single ball in. There's no sizzling, it's not ready. You can pull it right out. That's a good sign too to tell if you're ready to go. Balls are ready, pan is heating up, pasta's going. Are there any other questions? Now is a perfect time as we bring this all together.
Delay, so.
Oh yeah, well. The live, what is it, like 30 seconds behind or so? Technically, I guess we're not exactly live. There's a 30 seconds delay, which is out of my control. It's not intentional. It's a YouTube thing. I don't know why they do that.
Yikes,
Caught it! And you'll see that in 30 seconds from now. So, pan is getting hot, heating up, getting ready. I can see a ripple in the oil, very close. Ball goes in. I immediately start to see the sizzle. I'm going to drop the rest of my meatballs into the pan. Be sure not to crowd your pan. You want to give yourself enough room so that they're not all touching and sticking together.
Why such baby meatballs? This is from Ankita.
Oh, Ankita, great question. So like I was saying before, I like the little meatballs so that they're the same exact size as the pasta. And then that way, when everything gets coated in pesto, it's almost like a surprise as to whether or not you're getting a bite of a meatball or you're getting a bite of the pasta. You could make very large meatballs. You could make very large pieces of pasta. But I kind of like to have that little bit of a surprise or that like fun moment, whimsical moment when you're eating the bowl and you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting a meatball. That was a meatball.
You like fun recipes.
Yeah, I like fun eating.
Fun
you know,
eating.
it's not like challenging for your mind. It's more like just like challenging for your palate.
Yeah.
So we're getting a little bit of color just on one side. Then we'll flip them all over, get a little bit of color on the other side. It only takes, a minute or so, as long as your pan is nice and hot.
It should smell so good.
It should smell wonderful. You can start to come in and loosen everybody from the bottom of the pan. Once you get nice heat under there, you can flip them all over to the other side. So that way you're getting color on both sides of the meatballs. You don't necessarily need to get browning everywhere. I just like two sides of color. And these are going to cook very fast. They're small. That's another reason I like these small meatballs with the salami in there, because it allows you then to get a little bit of color on there. We could kill our pan all the way down now to low heat. And I'm going to pretend like these are still on heat, but they're really just over here. I'm going to bring my pot back to a boil. And so I'm kind of doing a little TV fake out here, almost as if those are still cooking. Pasta's about to go in the water. If you have a stove with more than one burner, you can do everything at once. You can cook your pasta as your meatballs are cooking. Drop these into the water. I'm going to throw the lid back on here just to help the water come back to a boil very quick. And now these pasta, these little guys, they only take about 2, maybe 4 minutes to cook. Once they float, you got, I would say about 30 to 60 seconds once they're floating until they're done. A great way to tell if they're done is to just give one a taste. You don't need to throw it against the wall and see if it sticks like spaghetti. No need to do that. Instead, just taste it. Is it tender? Is it soft? Is it cooked all the way through, or is it still a little bit doughy? You could always cut one in half. A great way to tell. Split one open, take a look at the center. If you notice that the inside is all one color, you see nice little air bubbles in there from the dough and the egg souffling and cooking, you know you're done and good. If you look at the center of your piece of pasta, and there are 2 different colors in there, maybe white on the outside and a different color white in the middle, it needs to cook a little bit longer. It's not ready. It needs a tiny bit more time. So meatballs over here on the side. Pasta, we'll give it a quick stir. It's just about back at a boil. Everybody should start floating here in a second. What I'm going to do is I have beautiful color on all 2 sides of my meatballs. I'm going to grab a little bit of my starchy pasta water here and add it to my pan. That's going to stop everybody from frying and allow everybody to come off the bottom of the pan so that way they can roll around and be ready to go as soon as the rest of our pasta comes in. That pasta water is a great way if you see something's happening too quickly in a pan, maybe you're at cacio e pepe, your pepper's toasting too quickly, grab a little bit of that pasta water, stops the toasting, stops the caramelizing. The water is going to put everything on pause for you so you can catch back up with the rest of your ingredients. What did I do with my strainer? So we've been about 2 minutes here. I'm going to give about 1 more minute as this comes right back to a simmer. And then we're going to bring everything together. We're going to go noodles, our little baby pasta here, into our pan with our meatballs. We're going to bring this back over the heat. We're going to add, simmer. Once everything starts to coat, the fat from the olive oil and the meatballs start to emulsify with the starchy water, the starches from the pasta leach out, thickening the sauce. Everything will get nice and creamy and delicious looking without having to add anything. At that point, we're going to kill our heat. It's going to be piping hot. We're going to grab our pesto, add a couple of spoonfuls of pesto, and just stir to emulsify. That's what the Italians call trascinare, which means to drag through. Trascinare. Which means to drag through very roughly or loosely. Translated. What that means is the combination, the marriage of the noodle and the sauce together to turn into pasta. We've often got misled by some very large corporation restaurant chains here in the United States that have us come to think that it is pasta plus sauce equals your dish, when it's really noodle plus sauce equals pasta. And that's that magic that's going to happen here in the pan after everything cooks and comes together. So everybody's floating now. I'm going to give it about 30 more seconds, and you see everybody slowly come to the top of the pot. Like I said, I don't mind using the same water here as I blanched all of my veggies in, because the water tastes good. I gave it a taste. All my greens were nice and clean. There's no dirt or anything on them, so I just know that dark color is from the degraded chlorophyll. Tastes bright, fresh, delicious, almost like a summertime aromatic tea. And so I know that's just going to add flavor all throughout the rest of my dish. Everybody's floating. Always give yourself a little bit of a spot check. Make sure nobody's stuck to the bottom of the pan. You can always cut one in half just to take a look at the inside. Make sure it's cooked all the way through. Like I said, what you're looking for is one even homogeneous color all the way through. I know this isn't, planet Earth. We're not in super high definition. You can't see the exact center of my gnocchi ball, but maybe one day we should be there. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you cut yours in half open. I'm going to grab the rest of these. Any bit of that pasta water that comes with you is always a good thing. Everybody now in the pan, and now you're starting to see why everybody's the same size, because now when we cut our pesto in here, we're going to see some magic happen. So we can remove our water. Water's done. Back over the heat. Done with our strainer. Now we'll bring our heat back up, swirling with about an ounce or so of pasta water down here in the bottom of the pan. Let's put so we can see what's going on. Come up a little higher. There we go. Now we're in the pan. We're going back up over the heat, bringing the heat back up. We can see here down at the bottom of the pan, there's still quite a bit of liquid. That's that pasta water. We want to quickly cook this, bring it to a simmer. That'll tighten up the sauce, reduce that pasta water, at which point then we'll be able to spoon in our pesto and enjoy. So we're not going to reduce it to the point where all of the pasta water disappears. You're just reducing it down to where it starts to glaze and coat all of the noodles. I always like to keep a tiny bit of that sauce, that water down on the bottom of the pan. So that way when we add our pesto, if you have a very thick pesto, what ends up happening is that it helps loosen the sauce out and coat all of your noodles. So the pesto's already cooked. We don't need to boil or simmer the pesto. We're just swirling over the residual heat of the pan to toss, to coat, to melt all of that cheese, to marry the noodles and the sauce together as one in a happy marriage known as pasta.
It should smell so good in your homes right now.
Oh my God, it is divine.
So delicious.
So we could go off the heat. What I'm looking for whenever I'm bringing together a pan of pasta, a great thing is if you're able to drag your spoon through the pan and you see a division, it holds a line in the bottom of the pan. That's a great sign that you have the right amount of starch and sauciness that's going to coat every noodle. And when you go and put it into your bowl, it's not going to just all drip off of the noodles and sit in the bottom in a pool and you'll have naked noodles sitting on top, because that's not what we want. Grab my herbs, I accidentally trapped my herbs down underneath. So we're going to go everybody down into the bowl now. You can eat this right out of the pan, but like I said, you eat with your eyes first.
I would not eat it out of the pan.
Bella's very proper. You could eat it out of the pan. I'm not saying you should. So one nice big bowl. Give ourselves a little bit of a wipe. We eat with our eyes first, right? Now we have our beautiful little pasta, a little bit of extra cheese. Mamma mia. And then of course, our little baby herbs. Little petite pieces of parsley, mint, basil, carrot tops, whatever it is that you have, just torn. You could use tweezers if you want it to be really fancy. Or you just rip off nice little pieces to use as garnish.
I think the chef's table being telling me
Yeah.
maybe.
Nice classical yo-yo ma.
Yes, that works too.
That works very well.
And here we are, everyone.
And scene.
You all just made pasta.
Start to finish, a beautiful bowl of pasta. Well, in this case, I didn't cook cavatelli, but ricotta gnocchetti, mortadella meatballs, and our pea pesto, which is good on not just pasta, it's good on just about everything. This freezes well, this freezes well, your meatballs freeze well. You could have food for the rest of the week, for the month. I wouldn't say year because that's a really long time to keep something in the freezer, but we're going to give this a little taste test as we wait for any questions to come rolling in, because I know we might have a little bit of a delay, and I can't wait any longer. I think it's cool enough where I'm not going to burn my mouth. We're going to jump in here.
Oh, baby, baby.
Oh, baby, baby. It's heavenly. I think that's the best way to put it. It's heavenly. Do yourself a favor, get a bite with the pasta and the meatball together as one, because you don't know which one is going to be first, and then you chew and you bite, and it's like meat, goodness, salty, savory, creamy, tender, cheesy, pesto-y, herby, everything, all of the things all in one. This is one of my favorite recipes that I have, and I'm so happy everyone was here and learned how to do this with me.
And then if you're not here as well, which we know a lot of people, sign up for the class and then they watch it later or when they have time or during the week or whatever it may be, make sure to message Joe on Instagram. Use the taco emoji if you have any questions at all. Make sure to have it right in the beginning, taco emoji, and then your question, because messages get really lost.
Exactly. Use the taco emoji if you're watching this in Instagram on a DM. The taco emoji is like our secret connecting tool to each other. It's how I know you took one of these classes, that hey, you have an important question for me. I want to take the time to give you an answer, because maybe you weren't here live, or maybe you were and you're curious about something. Use the taco emoji. I'll be more than happy to get back to you. And like Bella said, messages can easily get lost in there. So the taco emoji is like our little secret connection.
Yay! And then we do have a few questions from Bill. Could you use a tomato-based sauce? Absolutely.
No, you're not allowed. Tomatoes are not allowed. No, of course, Bill. Yes. Tomatoes would be awesome here. Summertime is coming up. Dirty Girl has their dry farm tomatoes. Not yet.
In San Francisco?
Yeah, I think Bill's in San Francisco here.
Yes, Bill's
right?
in San Francisco.
Bill's in San Francisco. I knew
yeah.
Bill. Shout out Bill. And so, yes, tomato sauce would be great here. I would go with a lighter tomato sauce. I think this pasta really lends itself to something bright, acidic, sweet, summery. But at the same time, I did this the other day with like some veal bolognese and truffle butter, and it was like killer to die for too. It was a little on the heavy side, definitely like more of a winter leaning dish, but delicious nonetheless. Yeah, great call. I would go with a like barely cooked tomato sauce if you're gonna go tomato flavor with this. A little bit of garlic, still with maybe some basil, lots of parm, olive oil instead of butter would be soigné.
Andrew said, how long, or Andrea, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name improperly, how long can the pesto last in the fridge?
So the pesto, it's not going to necessarily turn brown before it goes bad because we blanched it, which is, so normally you would look at pesto when it's brown, it's not good, as a sign. This will stay green for a while. I'd say you get about 3 days out of it is usually my start to question it sort of thing. But at the same time, what I've done and what I've seen people do is you could get an ice cube tray and you could freeze it in ice cubes. And then you just pop out an ice cube every time you need it. And you have a little bit of pesto that's ready to go for whatever you're using it for. And you can throw a couple of your pesto ice cubes right into the pan. Toss, and you're ready to go. Because it freezes really well. And that'll stop it from going bad. But otherwise, I'd say you have about 3 days. I like to dip chips in it. Put it on roasted chicken. It's great. It's like a base for other veggies. If you have some grilled broccoli or something, throw some pesto down, broccoli on top. Now we're talking.
F. Boyer says, if we're using frozen peas, do they need to be defrosted first?
So frozen peas, I would defrost. You could go frozen right from the bag. But what's going to end up happening is you're just going to quickly lower the temperature of your blanching water. So if you're not going to defrost them, I would go peas first. Let your water come back to a boil. Then add all of your herbs and continue as normal. But even though your frozen peas are already blanched, you need to blanch them again to take the cold off of them.
Andrea says, is there anything to take into consideration when making the dough at altitude?
Cooking. Altitude often changes the way that they're cooked, how long they take to cook, how quickly water comes to a boil. In terms of to take into account when making the dough, usually at a higher altitude, it is drier. So you might, the cheese is it's a wet dough. So I would say maybe you don't need as much flour, maybe. But otherwise it's not really a dry dough that you need to account for with extra moisture. It's kind of the opposite where it's a wet dough that usually you have to account for extra flour. So in this case, just, use your best judgment. Nothing else crazy, there's no baking involved, where baking is usually where things change drastically at high altitude. But in this case, like I said, a very forgiving and approachable pasta dough.
Yeah, I think that's the only question.
So good.
Thank you, everyone.
Great job, everyone. I'm so proud of every one of you. Thank you for joining us, inviting the two of us into your home today. Looking forward to the next one of these, which we have, June? We're in May right now? Correct? I'm looking at you like I'm crazy.
Yes.
Sorry. You know how the brain works. We're in May now. Next one's hopefully in June, so everybody stay tuned for that. Lots of exciting announcements on the horizon. Thank you to all my pasta people out there. Again, I look forward to seeing you all on Instagram and seeing what everybody makes. If you do have any questions, don't forget, we have the taco emoji from our hearts to yours. We love you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great and happy Sunday.
Thank you. Thank you from Uni and Yoki as well. Happy Sunday.